In 2004, a little game by the name of Monster Hunter was released in Japan. It found a moderate degree of success, and certainly did an excellent job of feeling like a fresh and new take on the fantasy genre. This was due in no small part to the monsters themselves. They were diverse, interesting, and original, and there was one in particular that stood head and shoulders above the rest. And I mean that quite literally. All of that is to say that gigantic monsters have always been a part of Monster Hunter. Like, seriously, they've been around since the very first entry, and you'd be hard-pressed finding a fan of the series that hasn't fought something really, really big at least once. Yeah, okay, most of the monsters in the series are pretty big, but I'm talking like super duper big, you know? Whether it's chasing down Kul'Taroth in the caverns of El Dorado, diving deep into the ancient ruins with Cedius, or falling asleep during the Zora Magdaros hunt, there's something about this subset of monsters that can be really hit or miss. These have come to be known as the Siege Quests, hunts that aren't a simple matter of throwing down with a monster, but rather an attempt by Capcom to make an experience that is larger and more epic. The stakes are higher, the monsters are larger, and the maps are unique to this single encounter. Most of the time. But before the likes of Kul'Taroth, Zora Magdaros, Jen Moran, Cedius, Gogmazios, Dalamadur, Shen Garen came along, there was a monster whose reputation precedes it, and unfortunately that reputation is not always a good one. I am Peak Ginge, don't forget to like and subscribe, and today I want to ask the question, was Lao-Shan Lung really that bad? Quick side note, I am a little bit sick, so if I sound a bit off, that would be why. Alright, let's do it. As it stands, Lao-Shan Lung has appeared in all of the Gen 1 and Gen 2 games, Monster Hunter Frontier and Online, and most recently in Generations Ultimate, and so I went back and challenged all the versions that I have access to jog my memory, because it had certainly been a while since I had versed one. Introduced as one of the 3 Elder Dragons in the first Monster Hunter game, Lao-Shan Lung was far and away the largest monster in the series for a little bit, and began this trend of quests that would much later come to be known as sieges in Monster Hunter World. For many old school hunters, it was their first introduction to the idea, and for better or worse, it has remained in the community's consciousness ever since, with very clear comparisons being made between it and Zora Magdaros. It's a monster that sticks with you even if you didn't enjoy hunting it, and frankly, it is easy to see why. Before we get into the bad, let's talk about one of Lao's best qualities. Its visual design and presentation. At nearly 70 meters from nose to tail, Lao towers over most monsters in the series, even when it's standing on all fours. Its design motif is sort of this halfway point between traditional Eastern and Western dragon tropes. It features a very long body and lacks any form of wings, much like Eastern depictions of dragons, and yet it still has a lot of bulk and brute strength, much like Western ones. Lao's colors contrast well, with a copper red shell adorning most of its body, and a light cream colored underside. The only issue is that the environment you fight it in doesn't really do it any favors here, because the lighting is always very drab. Its frill and horn also allow for it to have some unique features, and the way its carapace juts from its back and layers over itself make for a simple but interesting silhouette, I think. All of these elements are at their best when Lao decides to stand tall and rear itself up onto its back legs. Here is where its weight is on full display as it stomps towards whatever it's attacking, usually a castle, and honestly all of its animations here really do sell the force behind it pretty well, I'd say. It is a simple but effective design, much like the Rathalos, and conveys that this monster is here to mess shit up. Unfortunately, this isn't exactly on display in its gameplay. Lao-Shan Lung's combat is it's something. The concept is straightforward and not exactly unique, but it is cool enough. A dragon is approaching and the only thing standing between it and destroying the town is you and the fortress. Lao is supposedly fleeing from Fatalis, which is why it has been driven towards civilization, despite usually being very reclusive, which is a neat enough idea and instills a sense of fear, I think. I mean, if this gigantic creature is scared enough to run away from another monster, how screwed would I be against that monster? But that's off topic. The fortress map, at least in its first iteration, is boring. It's boring. There's 3 long areas and a final arena, and everything kinda just looks the same. It's all pretty uninteresting, and I'll go over how Lao navigates that area in just a moment. But for some reason, I remember enjoying this whole experience as a kid. I guess that there was a degree of wonder because of how big it is that it instilled within me, and I suppose when you're a kid, you don't really care what you do in a video game, you just care that you get to play a video game. Maybe that was just me. Anyway, Lao-Shan Lung was an online exclusive monster in the first Monster Hunter game, and whilst this is technically accessible today thanks to the hard work of the fandom, I personally don't have access to it at the moment, so I went to the next best thing, Monster Hunter Freedom. In this game, Lao was moved to be one of the final quests in the village, only unlocking after you have completed every single other quest. And yes, that does include the Powderstone quest, which was a trauma that I must have blocked from my memory because it was worse than I could have possibly imagined or remembered. But I digress. Jumping straight in, I will say that the intro cutscene for Lao is pretty good, actually. It sells the size and weight of this monster very well with all the screen shaking and the lower angled shots. It's all good and well done, especially considering how old it is. So the hunt begins with you overlooking Lao walking past the fortress. You head inside to grab your supplies, and it feels pretty tense, honestly. This is clearly a place that should be full of people, but it isn't. It's just you and your supplies prepping to take down a mountain of a monster. It's cool, and it's a pretty strong image right out the gate. The gameplay then begins as you venture outside, head down this long foggy corridor, and wait until the Lao-Shan Lung shows up. And boy does he take his time. There's probably an argument to be made that this builds tension, but the problem is that the feedback on that tension isn't really there. The monster appears and slowly begins to approach you, and once he gets to you, he just keeps on approaching. I saw a comparison on Twitter a little while ago that I couldn't find again, unfortunately, but it said that the Lao-Shan Lung fight is like single-handedly trying to stop a forest fire, which is a cool analogy that I can see where they're coming from. Lao is tenacious and mostly unflinching in its advance. Every now and then you'll hit the damage threshold and it will recoil, but it won't stop and it will continue forward. But I'm not about to pretend it's super fun though. Combat-wise, there's little that you actually need to do aside from moving forward with it to continue hitting the weak spot. There are a few sections where if you go up on a bridge over the main path, Lao will rear up and snap at you, and I must say, it standing on two legs is quite an intimidating thing, but otherwise it just literally pays you no mind at all. And back to that wildfire analogy, yeah, it makes it seem like it's an unstoppable force, especially because it can't be killed before the final zone, but it also makes for very unengaging gameplay, and it feels odd for you to be able to attack a creature until it is dead without it actually doing anything to defend itself from you. The final zone is then quite a thematic little experience if you play in a specific way. If you jump off the fortress gate and run toward Lao straight away, it's pretty much the same as the previous zones, except that it can die now. But if you remain on the castle gate and await Lao's approach, it's a pretty cool sight watching it slowly emerge from the fog and stand upright to begin its attack on the castle. You then of course have access to the Dragonator and the Ballista, which, side note, I don't know if I'm just dumb, but have the Ballista always been used individually in the first generation? That was wild. You have to get on the Ballista, shoot a shot, get off it, and get on it again to shoot another shot. That is crazy, man. All that said and done, Lao-Shan Lung fell, and as is standard practice, his head fell into the terrain, and so I missed out on 3 calves. I will say that the old trend of the huge monsters having multiple calve zones was cool. I did like that a lot, and it made for a more rewarding calving phase, if not cutting it a little close with the 60-second time limit. Moving on now to Generation 2 Lao-Shan Lung, and for a bit of variety, I decided to revisit the G-rank version of the Ashen subspecies given to it in Freedom, and well, it's almost an identical experience to the previous one, albeit a bit higher resolution. And this thing also has a crap load of health because I actually didn't slay it, just repelled it, which I suppose makes sense, it is a hub quest after all. There's very little to say about this that I haven't already said, aside from it all feeling a little bit smoother because this was a 2nd generation game, and as such is a more refined experience mechanically. So yeah, it's kind of just the same thing, this one was just a different color, which is cool. The big guy then completely dips from the mainline series for like a whole decade before being once again made available to take on in Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate. And finally, they freshened him up a bit. Just a bit though. Obviously the first thing here is the gameplay of the hunter themselves. The end of the 4th generation added arts and styles that drastically changed the moment-to-moment gameplay, much like the wirebugs in Rise, and the ones you choose to go with can dramatically alter the fight. Next, and perhaps most dramatically, are the map changes. There are now only 2 areas that Lao-Shan Lung will march through, and they are both basically unrecognizable from their earlier counterparts, apart from the general architecture being the same. In the first area, there is now a track cannon from the Gogmasius arena, which can run alongside Lao for the duration of the fight, pelting him with cannonballs if someone mans it correctly. On top of that, the fortress has also been kitted out with its own demolisher, to just blast Lao-Shan Lung in half with. The second area then then has its own track cannon, and of course the iconic Dragonator, and is drastically smaller than it was previously. And honestly, all of this makes for a far more engaging fight that actually does feel like a castle siege. The only problem that then arises now is that it's just a bloody pain in the ass to do solo because you have so many different aspects to manage. Trying to juggle the fortification management with attacking its stomach makes for a tense experience, yeah, but in the same way that managing your Sims can be tense, not in a holy crap, this thing is epic and awesome kind of way. You know what I mean? Don't get me wrong though, it's actually one of the few times I've felt the fortification combat is actually enjoyable and meaningful in the series, but it's just very clearly designed for multiplayer rather than single player, and that's fine. That's cool. This is Monster Hunter after all. Honestly, in my opinion, this is the best iteration we've got of Lao to date though. As I said before, Lao also shows up in Monster Hunter Frontier and Online, the former of which I haven't gotten a chance to get up and running yet, and the latter is unfortunately entirely inaccessible. I hear the Frontier version is considerably faster and can also be killed in any zone, which is neat enough, but it seems pretty similar, and the one from Online sort of seems like a precursor to Rampages, with wave upon wave of smaller monster fleeing from Lao-Shan Lung before Lao itself shows up. So as of right now, that's where Lao-Shan Lung has been left. There's obvious similarities to be drawn between it and Zora Magdaros in world, though the less we think of that snooze fest, the better, I think. I believe that Lao set out to achieve a grand scale, and back in 2004, I think it did an alright job. But as time went on and Monster Hunter evolved, I just don't think it really kept up the pace. Colossal monster fights and sieges in general are hit or miss, but there are plenty of examples of great ones throughout the series' lifetime. Gen Moren still feels exciting to this day. Kulve Taroth somehow made a siege monster out of something that uses the same animations as the Great Jagras, even if the loot system was a bit shit, and Gogmazios is just top to bottom a great experience. So alongside those ones, Lao seems pretty lackluster for sure, but I think it does get a little bit more hate than it deserves. So what is the answer to our question then? What's the answer to, was Lao-Shan Lung really that bad? Well, I think back in its first iteration, yes and no. Sure, it wasn't the most engaging fight, but it was certainly immersive, I think. Monster Hunter hasn't always been this hyper-action-packed series it's sort of known as these days. Sure, the combat has always been there, but back when it first came out, it was just as much about the feeling and the vibe of facing off against these massive creatures as it was gathering your resources slowly and meticulously. Lao-Shan Lung did evolve over the years, but not quite fast enough to keep up, especially considering that by the time we got to the Generations fight, we'd already had the likes of Gen Moren and Gogmazios for a few years. And so I'm a little bit on the fence, to be honest. This monster does hold a lot of nostalgia for me after all, so I'm inclined to say that Lao-Shan Lung was not really that bad, but unfortunately the rose-colored glasses may be swaying me just a little bit too much. So with that, let me know what you think about Lao-Shan Lung in the comments down below. Thanks for watching the video, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and why not share it with a friend if you think they'll like it too. It was surprisingly a lot of fun to take a trip down memory lane with Lao-Shan Lung, and I'm looking forward to getting stuck into a lot more videos for you guys. Anyway, that's it for me with this video. I'll catch you guys on the next one. See ya!